Journalism has now pitted, it's divided, it goes after different segments of society instead of going after all of us. It's niche journalism. And a lot of this is due to what happens when technology meets ideology. And the technology I'm referring to, Jonathan, is the advent of the internet. The internet broke journalism.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. We have a lot to discuss today about the way media bias works, and then we have an important interview with Ari Fleischer to talk about his new book, whether there's really a war on democracy going on, and to discuss the upcoming midterm elections. But first, a programming note. Next week, we won't be having a regular Top Story podcast, but we will be breaking down the Israeli elections results in a special JNS TV program on Wednesday, November 2nd. I'll be on with my friend and colleague, Ruthie Bloom, breaking down the story and what's happening. There will be other JNS analysts and reporters also on that program to tell you everything you need to know about what happened in the Knesset election. Now, before we start today's podcast, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And now to today's program. We know that Americans are now so divided to the point where right and left not only no longer read, listen, and watch the same media. That's actually been a trend that's been going on and growing for the last 2 decades. But in part because of the rise of social media, which allows us to completely isolate ourselves from differing opinion and perspectives, it's got a lot worse. It's now painfully obvious that Americans with differing political affiliations and beliefs not only think differently about the issues, they view each other, and especially the political leaders of their opponents, as not so much wrong, but evil, and determined to take away their freedoms. That's something that even the flagship of liberal media bias, the New York Times, noted recently, when in an article about voters in Wisconsin, an article about the left's favorite current talking point, the war on democracy, that is supposedly being waged by Republicans, it was forced to note that the notion of our liberties being at peril was shared by voters on both sides of the political divide. The problem is that they don't agree on who's to blame. Liberals think conservatives are, in President Joe Biden's words, semi-fascists that threaten the republic. Conservatives believe that the threat comes from the left, big tech, censorship, and the efforts to indoctrinate children and anyone else with their toxic theories about race. There's plenty to blame to go around for this distrust, including those leaders who have coarsened political discourse with insults. But the main culprit is the mainstream media itself. While liberals deprecate any source that doesn't follow their talking points, what they fail to realize is that the transformation of almost all of the country's leading newspapers like the Times and the Washington Post, as well as the broadcast networks and cable news stations other than Fox, into centers of liberal and leftist advocacy rather than straight news reporting, has created not merely a biased media, but that one half of the country believes is overtly partisan, inherently unfair, and dedicated to treating only one side of our political arguments as not only correct, but legitimate. This distrust, which is mirrored by the way the people on the left regard conservative media, has created a bifurcated nation that is at war with itself. The Times itself provided a perfect example of this with a story published only recently in which it acknowledged that President Biden tells a great many untruths, but argued that his lies should be regarded as merely benign grandfatherly tall tales rather than vicious lies like those that he claims are told by former President Donald Trump. The idea that some lies are okay, while others are not because one man should be thought of as decent and the other isn't, is so transparently biased and absurd that it's a wonder that even the woke activists that edit the nation's leading newspaper thought it worthwhile to publish it. But in their eyes, Biden's inability to tell the truth on details large and small in his speeches required some sort of an explanation. Of course, while Trump is indeed guilty of saying a great many things that aren't true, exaggerations and a hyperbole that he and his followers might excuse as merely trying to illustrate a point, Biden's personal history of serial fabulism, which dates back to his early life, is also a matter of record. The point here isn't that there is a reasonable argument to be made that anything both men say should be taken with a shovelful of salt. It's that the blatant double standards by which the so-called paper of record reports the news, as well as its habit of injecting left-wing politics into virtually every article, regardless of the subject, and to put an editorial into every headline, even those purporting to be straight news, means no one should take anything it reports at face value. And the Times isn't the only mainstream outlet about which this can be said. There are lots of reasons why this happened, but to deny it is not only to fly in the face of the facts, but to fail to understand how and why our politics and our society is so broken. It also helps explain, in part, the rise of anti-Semitism and how it is being tolerated on both ends of the political spectrum in a society in which few are willing to condemn political allies, even when they are guilty of blatant hate speech. One person who has taken a deep dive into this issue is Ari Fleischer. Fleischer is best known for having been President George W. Bush's press secretary and the author of a memoir of his time in the cauldron of the White House, Taking Heat. Since then, he's become the head of his own communications firm, where he advises figures in the corporate world and in sports, as well as appearing on Fox News as a contributor. His latest book, Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias, Why the Press Gets So Much Wrong and Doesn't Care, is an important analysis of this issue and a must-read. And we're thrilled to have him back on with us today to discuss his book, as well as the impact the collapse of the press has had on politics and the surge in anti-Semitism. Ari Fleischer, welcome back to Top Story.
Jonathan, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. We're really thrilled you were able to make the time to join us today. There's a lot I'd like to discuss with you, but most of all, we want to talk about your very important new book. You begin it with a discussion of an unbalanced and biased panel on CNN to help explain why the media is so broken, and then continue with citations of far more similar instances than I could count that show just how blatant the double standards are when it comes to political bias. But rather than merely frame it as a problem for conservatives or Republicans, your goal, it seems to me, is to make a broader point about why our political systems, our societies become so dysfunctional. Tell us a little bit more about why, this is about more than which political party is getting a raw deal in the mainstream media.
Well, I hear all the time, where can I go to get the news straight? Who will just tell me the facts so I can make up my mind as a citizen and tell the government what to do? And it's just such a mass frustration among the American people, it seems to me. And so in my book, I really just took a look at what's called the mainstream media, ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the legacy media. And I find example after example after example of how they suppress the news that they don't like. They deceive people by putting information on the air that's wrong. There's a snobbery to the press. And these are all the issues that I write in my book, just showing how out of touch and out to lunch the American media have become.
Yeah, so I guess the main question is, I think a lot of people recognize the bias. Some are blind to it because it suits their political biases. But what is causing this? You titled one chapter, Reporters Have Lost Their Minds. But this is more than a case of mass hysteria. How did the overwhelming majority of journalists become not only so consistently aligned with one side of the political argument, But why is it that so many of them, including people we both know and perhaps once thought of as sober observers, even if we disagreed with their politics, now think there's nothing wrong with biased reporting?
The chapter prior to Reporters Have Lost Their Minds is a chapter I begin the book with called Original Sin. And I make the case, Jonathan, that the original sin of the media is they all look alike, drink alike, talk alike, they think alike. They are cut from way too identical a cloth. I tell a story about my trips to Columbia Journalism School, where I address classes of the next great generation of journalists. And at the end of each of my little remarks to these journalists, future journalists, I said, in the prior election, how many of you voted Democrat and how many Republican? And on all my trips, unanimously, every single person in that room said they voted for the Democrat in the prior election. Not a single one for the Republican. And this is the original sin. Across journalism schools, across the nation, overwhelmingly, you have people who go into journalism as liberals, who are taught by liberal professors, who then graduate and go into newsrooms overwhelmingly dominated by liberal reporters. They all see the world through the same lens. And this is why in 2016, they were stunned that Donald Trump possibly could have won. Everybody they knew thought Donald Trump was going to lose to Hillary Clinton. The whole newsroom thought that. All their neighbors, their friends on the Upper West Side or in Washington, D.C. suburbs thought the same thing. Journalism has a terrible lack of ideological diversity. And until it fixes that, I don't think they're ever going to see America for the way America is, a 50-50 country in which there are some very smart, well-meaning, devoted people who are conservative. But instead, they're seen kind of like creatures at a zoo that you go visit and you look at these conservatives and then you leave. The press is missing what's making America tick, and it's showing up in how badly they're reporting.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, so many of the articles, when especially when the Times, the Washington Post tries to cover conservatives, it reminds me kind of a National Geographic special, about what's going on in the jungle somewhere. Now, this is partly a function of the demographics of journalism, as you just pointed out, but it's also a function of the business of journalism, right, and how so many outlets, including some of the most prestigious ones like the Times, which you discuss in the book, now believe it is in their interest to cater to only one niche of political opinion, yet while still claiming to be fair and unbiased. And I think this relates to a poll that you commissioned as research for your book, which probed the attitudes of those who read the Times and watch Fox and CNN. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with this. I hired a pollster, Frank Luntz, to survey readers of the New York Times, viewers of CNN, and viewers of Fox. And then I asked a series of questions measuring how these people think about different things in our society. And what I found is that New York Times and CNN readers or viewers are from Venus, and Fox viewers are from Mars. I mean, just take little things I asked about. Is it okay to take a knee during the national anthem? People who watch CNN and read the New York Times say, yes, it is okay to do that. People who watch Fox overwhelmingly say it's not okay to do that. On issue after issue, people see America differently. And this is why, if you read the New York Times, you see stories about how principled, heroic even, it is to take a knee. And if you watch Fox, you see how disrespectful it is, especially to our military, to take a knee. And this is what's happened to journalism. Journalism has now pitted, it's divided, it goes after different segments in society instead of going after all of us. It's niche journalism. And a lot of this is due to what happens when technology meets ideology. And the technology I'm referring to, Jonathan, is the advent of the internet. The internet broke journalism. It destroyed, especially for print newspapers, advertising revenues that came substantially from corporations who didn't want fringes to be focused on in where they advertised. They wanted to sell to everybody. And that advertising pressure kept journalists at least somewhat honest. Now that advertisers have gone away and journalists only get their income really now from subscriptions, the New York Times boasts how its subscribers are really resistance subscribers. That's why they signed up to the New York Times. So financially, the New York Times has to be wise. Can they print all these stories about Joe Biden's ethics, Joe Biden's age, Joe Biden's problems, why Donald Trump actually deserves huge credit for the destruction of ISIS, for the Abraham Accords, for many of his foreign policy successes, including arming Ukraine including getting NATO to spend more money. If the New York Times started to tell balanced stories like that, they lose a lot of their resistant subscribers. And this is the trend now, where technology has caused journalism to go into its camps, its quarters, and ideology for the left has meant we're going to tell one story to pump up the anti-Trump resistance, and Donald Trump helped make all that happen on his watch.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how, this became a business model. I mean, it is, as you say, the opposite of what journalism used to think was in their interests. I noted Batya Ungar-Sargon, who also wrote an interesting book on media bias, noted that, in one instance of the Times Style magazine had on its cover a story about Angela Davis, the communist revolutionary, leftist activist, and on the back a Cartier watch. It's sort of like that's who's reading this, that's who's buying that stuff, and it all comes together in a kind of strange melange of that makes that newspaper and makes similar outlets only appeal to just one segment of the country and ignoring everybody else and demonizing everybody else.
And I put a poll in here. It was either a Gallup or a Pew poll, and it showed that there's only one group of Americans who believe that the press understands people like them. And that group is college-educated Democrats. If you're a Democrat with a high school diploma, you don't think the press understands you. If you're independent with either a college degree or a high school diploma, the press doesn't understand you. And Republicans, of course, for decades have said the press doesn't understand them. This is the problem. If you look at the New York Times, if you look at CNN, if you look at major media today, what you really have is college-educated, overwhelmingly Democratic voters who report the news for fellow college-educated Democratic voters. It's a bubble talking to a bubble. It's a bubble that thinks climate change is the biggest issue in the world. It's a bubble that thinks that Roe v. Wade needs to be codified. It's a bubble that thinks that the Supreme Court was wrong to allow the states to make those decisions. It is that type of college-educated sentiment. And what's so fascinating about American life today is the parties are changing bases. Republicans are increasingly becoming the party of working people, people with lower income, and people with less education. And Democrats are increasingly, as the New York Times, becoming the party of well-off, college-educated voters, people with PhDs and people with masters. It's a fascinating change underway in America, and the media reflects it.
Yeah, and a dangerous one, I think, as you point out, in many respects. I think one of the more important lessons you impart in your book is that media bias isn't just a matter of slanted stories. A lot of media monitoring organizations are always, taking deep dives and analyzing stories, but it's also a matter of suppressing stories that undermine whatever political narratives journalists are trying to enforce while hyping those that might bolster it. Tell us a little bit more about how normal editorial judgment, which is part of everyday journalism, has become the engine of suppressing important stories that might change public opinion and even alter the outcomes of elections.
I write at length about what you didn't say. And I touched on one of the little issues earlier. It's not such a little issue, but the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords got muffled press from the mainstream media, especially the first enactment of the Abraham Accords. This was such a significant breakthrough. But to acknowledge that Donald Trump may actually be a peacemaker, maybe somebody who can engage in diplomatic gains around the world. And it wasn't just Bahrain or the UAE, it was Morocco, it was Kosovo, it was Muslim nations. And none of this would have happened without Saudi Arabia and Donald Trump. And the press didn't want to tell that story, so it was muted. But there's a host of others. I cited an example where there were two obscure Republicans who used absolutely inappropriate language. One was a state legislator in Ohio, one was a state legislator in Florida, inappropriate language against blacks. And the New York Times found these obscure legislators, reported what they said, and blew the whistle that nobody should speak that way. And they were right to do so, even if these people were unknown, obscure. Well, you would think if they're going to do that to obscure Republicans, they would do it to obscure Democrats. Tim Scott, black senator from South Carolina, Republican, gave the rebuttal to President Biden's first address to the Congress in 2021. A Democrat county chairman in Lamar County, Texas, called Tim Scott an Oreo after Scott gave that address. I looked at the New York Times. I looked at the Washington Post. I looked at ABC, NBC, CBS. Did any of them cover that? No, it was suppressed. And there's a host of issues like that in my book where Democrats say racially tinged things and they can get away with it. There's no coverage for it. And there are other issues throughout our society they just don't cover. How often do you see in the New York Times or CNN stories about a good guy with a gun stopping a bad guy with a gun and averting a shooting, averting a mass shooting because he took him out? You seldom will read that because it makes the case for gun ownership. How often do you read about the invisible hand of capitalism? The reason why people are able to make it in America and rise from poverty to lower middle income or from lower middle income to middle class or middle class and up, it's because of jobs, the invisible hand of capitalism, the benevolence of democratic capitalism. But instead, you just get a bullseye put on the back of people who go into business. All these are stories that are suppressed. And of course, is the most obvious one, which was about Joe Biden's lies about not knowing about his son's business deals, as was proven by all the emails and the texts that were found on Hunter Biden's laptop. Why isn't the press digging into why did Joe Biden lie about his son's business deals? Why is he contradicted by texts? The press suppressed that story. Big tech suppressed that story, which broke right before Election Day, and they did it deliberately. They're just stories they will not cover. If they covered it, it would make Donald Trump, actually, and Republicans more broadly, seem quite reasonable. And there are media outlets and the mainstream media who will not tell that story.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. And obviously, the Hunter Biden story is an ongoing scandal, and not so much just a scandal about him or about Joe Biden, but it's a media scandal. Switching gears slightly for a moment, I think we have to note that some of this is related to a rise not just in anti-Semitism, but the way it is being mainstream in some forums, and I think on both the left and the right. And it's deeply worrisome, but it's also, I think, a function of how the biased media and the political bifurcation it breeds helps to not only legitimize anti-Semitism, provide a more welcoming atmosphere to it, but also it's related to the way people won't turn on their allies. They won't talk about, they won't condemn, even if it's a conservative, whether, a Candace Owens, a prominent conservative podcaster and media person, defends Kanye West's anti-Semitism, and people on the right rise to her defense or rise to his defense because they perceive him as being on their side. I think this is related to this same subject, don't you?
Yeah, there is a lot to that. And, I'm proud to be on the board of a group, the Republican Jewish Coalition, where if we see anti-Semitism from a Republican candidate or a Republican office holder, we blow the whistle on them because there's a higher principle here that should unite all of us, whether we're Jews or as Americans, and that is make the fringes be fringes and don't accept them. When we can all condemn them, we really are able to isolate them and make them smaller. But when we rally because it kind of serves kind of my side of an equation, it's terrible for national unity, not to mention morality. And you put your finger on it. Nobody should be defending him over his anti-Semitic tweet. But there was a story that JNS broke. I remember reading it, and it involved a person named Mahed Abdel Kader, and the support a virulent anti-Semite in the United States who campaigns with Democratic candidates, who does fundraisers for Democratic candidates. This is a person whose Twitter feed and statements are just Holocaust denying anti-Semitism. You don't see much coverage of that, if any, in the mainstream media. Again, the left can get away with racially tinged behavior, with religiously anti-Semitic behavior. Who's behind all the anti-Semitic attacks in Crown Heights in Brooklyn? And that's a muted story. They'll blow the whistle right away if the extremism, if the bad behavior comes from the right. And they should. If I don't even consider it the right, I consider it such a fringe. But if it's the Proud Boys or if it's any of those fringe groups, blow the damn whistle on them. But do the same to the other side of the equation.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And obviously, even more prominent personalities than the one that you just cited, people like Congressman Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, or an activist like Linda Sarsour.
Yeah.
People on the left just say, well, they're our allies, and they rationalize and they make excuses. And that has bred, I think, a willingness for people on the right to do the same thing to people that they somehow perceived as being on their side, because we're just in this big culture, tribal culture war in which no quarter is given or taken, and that's the only thing that matters.
And that's why it's so important morally to blow the whistle in both directions and not to be afraid to do so. That's how you really reduce people in society. You don't let them grow beyond a fringe because everyone is condemning them. No one is looking to find an excuse for why they're all right. But there's another example here that I wrote about in the book, and that was in 2017 when Donald Trump was first elected. There were a wave of bomb threats made to JCCs, Jewish community centers throughout the United States. Hundreds of phone calls, shut down JCCs. And people blamed it on Donald Trump. Congressman Jerry Nadler of New York, Democrat, directly blaming it on Donald Trump. With
the Anti-Defamation League.
The old ADL would never have stood for that. The new ADL, which is a wing of the Democratic Party, said it was Donald Trump encouraged it. The mainstream media all wrote how Donald Trump encouraged it, if not in word, if not in deed, by nuance. It was done by a unfortunately mentally ill Israeli teenager and a liberal journalist in the United States, as it ultimately turned out months later, we learned. Donald Trump had zero to do with it. Now, the last 2 years of Joe Biden's administration, similar things have happened at the JCCs. People call in these bomb threats. It's terrible. Did anybody blame it on Joe Biden? Did anybody go back to their Trump reporting and say maybe we shouldn't have done it to Donald Trump since we're not doing it to Joe Biden? No. And this is where the left-wing press just lunges onto these things to make accusations about the right or about Donald Trump, even when they have no evidence and no facts to support them.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think one of the points you bring up and you talk about in the book is that people don't go back. I mean, occasionally, they'll make a correction, but the correction, is especially on the broadcast media, it's once and it's quickly, but it doesn't, the story had gone viral. There's no comparison to, there's no undoing the harm that they've done. I also want to ask a little bit about the way, you spoke about how the demographics of journalism have, really altered the way, the press operates. Kind of the same liberal elites who dominate the press have bought into critical race theory and intersectionality as theories and don't really question it. And these ideas often act as permission slips for anti-Semitism. And I think that has kind of helped to frame a lot of the discussion about Israel and anti-Semitic attacks in a very negative way. And I think it's related to this whole question of bias.
Yeah, and it's related to the way that a lot of left-wing Democrats, J Street, have created this environment where it's really okay to call Israel an apartheid state. It's okay to talk about boycotting Israel or divesting from Israel. And that left-wing fringe is the greatest threat to Israel from a policy point of view. And I don't understand how and where this grew up, other than for the areas that you just described. When I grew up, and my parents are liberal Democrats, ACLU Democrats, there was a principle here, a principle of free speech, a principle of right and wrong, and a principle of fighting for justice. Israel was front and center in that. The Jewish cause was front and center in that. But now you have this sense of intersectionality that's you're known by your racial identity or your orientation, and that is more important than your thinking. Your chromosomes are more important than your heart. It's how too often people on the left identify who's right and wrong on issues. And unfortunately, what they've decided is that Jews are white. Jews, some of them, are financially successful in the United States of America. So therefore, they must be wrong on policy. And Israel becomes an extension of that. And it's totally an immoral judgment about Israel, where they continue to struggle just to live in peace, where if Israel ever disarmed, Hamas and Hezbollah would attack in a second, and we all know that. But they don't want Israel to defend herself. And they even will form alliance with Iran or make exception or make allowance for Iran, as opposed to saying Israel deserves peace through strength too. And the United States should be part of that. And this left-wing liberal anti-Israel Democrat movement in the United States is really one of the biggest things that's undermined both Israel's cause and more broadly the cause of right or wrong in the United States if you don't think everything should be based on racial identity or orientation.
Yeah. Yeah. In your book, you mentioned that you interviewed Donald Trump while researching it. We could probably spend a whole podcast unpacking that conversation. But I just want to get your reaction to a recent controversy about Trump, a social media post that led to the latest attempts to brand him as an anti-Semite and relates to his support for Israel and attitudes about Israel. Can you unpack that for us and relate it to how this whole bias issue works?
Yeah, one of the big bugaboos I hear on the right from fellow Republicans a lot is why are Jewish Americans so overwhelmingly Democratic voters? Why do they vote that way when Republicans have been so good for Israel? And certainly you can make the case. I think it's hands down case. Donald Trump has been superb for Israel and for Americans who support Israel, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the solid support that he gave to Israel, the Abraham Accords, the destruction of ISIS, all of these, the killing of Soleimani in Iran, the way he's taken on Iran or took on Iran. So when Republicans see this, they don't understand that many Americans, Jewish Americans, don't vote on the basis of Israel only. People who are Jewish who vote on the basis of Israel and foreign policy tend to be Republican. People who are Jewish who vote on the basis of, say, abortion or redistribution of income or more of a socialistic approach to economic issues vote Democrat. And that's the frustration that I hear on the right a lot about why are Jews overwhelmingly voting Democrat. It's an accurate observation. Jews overwhelmingly vote Democrat. And the reason is to them, Israel is a secondary issue. It's not a primary issue.
Right. And so Trump pointing that out was seen as, he was accused of, anti-Semitism. But in that sense, I mean, you and I have we've reported, on this issue about why Jews vote for Democrats, why they don't prioritize Israel. He just said what was obvious, but yet somehow, I mean, it's like we're being gaslit to think that pointing out the obvious, and of course it was said in a very Trumpian way because, he was highlighting his own greatness or his perception of his own greatness, right. That's treated as anti-Semitism. And it's just like, what's going on here? Why is the truth somehow anti-Semitic there?
Back to the JCC bomb threats. It's Trump's fault.
Exactly.
And that's just the knee-jerk reaction. But, Jonathan, one of the cases I make in my book is one of the groups that's hurt the worst by this press bias are Democrats. Because if all you do is read the Times or watch CNN, you have such a distorted view of the world. And then something happens that shakes your worldview that you never knew was coming because nobody told you about it. Well, everybody else in society got to see it. So take 2016 and the election of Trump. If you watched CNN, if you listened to Nate Silver at 538 or the New York Times, you knew Hillary Clinton would win. There was no other possibility. And so lo and behold, Donald Trump wins because there are a lot of other Americans who don't read the New York Times or watch CNN. And all of a sudden, there's got to be a reason for this. This cannot be the truth. There's got to be an explanation. Voila, collusion. Voila, the Steele dossier. Aha, that had to be the reason. And there are so many issues like that where the Democrats just didn't see it coming. They didn't think there was a chance that Mueller wasn't going to indict Trump. They don't think they've met a juror yet anywhere in America or a judge anywhere in America who they don't think is about to lower the boom on Donald Trump. Yet it never happens.
Yeah.
But spoon-fed that story, and it makes it hard for those Democrats to understand what's really going on in America. And that's because the press doesn't tell them what's really going on in America. It's college-educated Democrats for college-educated Democrats. And most of America doesn't even have a college degree. Yet these people are so out of touch with what's really going on in America outside the major cities. And that's why I think in many ways the press hurts the Democrats more than they hurt Republicans. Because Republicans, for a couple of decades now, we've gotten used to going around the mainstream media, ignoring the mainstream media, have a thick skin about the mainstream media. Democrats still buy it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think, I would extend it a little bit. Yes, Republicans, conservatives, knew not to necessarily believe everything in the media. But I think the Russia collusion hoax really changed it. Fundamentally, it amped it up to the point where, in this last several months, where there have been stories about, the dispute between Trump and the Justice Department about classified documents that were at his home in Mar-a-Lago. I think most people on the right, didn't just ignore it. I mean, they don't believe a word that CNN or the New York Times are reporting about this, because it's being reported in the same way that they reported the whole Russia collusion story. I mean, it might be true. Some of it might be true, but how could you possibly believe it after they've already demonstrated that they will tilt the news and they will hype something that they probably even know isn't going to turn out to be true just to advance a narrative?
And that's so consistent. Just take CNN. How many anti-Trump bombshells did they drop to only later retract? And I walk through it in my book, example after example after. So when you hear somebody cry wolf all the time, and then there's the Mar-a-Lago raid, and they take these documents, which I do think is serious. This is one that really does bother me. As somebody who handled classified information, you do not have classified information outside of a facility where it's authorized. You don't have it at your home, whether you're a former president or not. Now, whether it rises up to a crime, I'd be very surprised. But he shouldn't have brought that information from the White House to Mar-a-Lago. But nevertheless, the issue from the journalist's point of view is when everything is impeachable, when everything is a felony, when everything is Trump is about to get indicted, and they just rotate from one to the next, they're the media that cried wolf. So you have to forgive people for not believing them anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You try to end your book on, if not a hopeful note, but one that points to a way forward to a more honest press and a less bifurcated society. But since you finished writing it, it's like you write a book and then it goes to press, and then, it takes a while before we can all read it. In my opinion, the problem has only gotten worse rather than better in the second year of Joe Biden's presidency, which, you didn't write about in your book because you had to stop at some point. I noted a recent story in the Times in which they tried to spin recently the president's habit of telling falsehoods as somehow being less bad than when Donald Trump does it. The bottom line is that it seems to me that the press is not only getting worse, but the consequences of their malpractice are getting worse, with both Republicans and Democrats not only not trusting the media, but believing their political opponents want to destroy them and their freedoms, as well as not trusting that elections will be fairly decided. In the time since you finished the book, have you found any reason to be more hopeful or optimistic about this problem?
Well, I'm always hopeful in the sense that America is a nation where a pendulum always swings back. And we're going through a phase now of partisan media. And it's like the way our republic was founded. We were founded with nothing but partisan media. This notion of objective media is a relatively new one, a 20th century notion. It lasted for a few decades. And now we're increasingly going back to pamphleteering style media that takes us
That's Philadelphia in the 1790s again.
Or American 1776, yes.
Right, yeah.
And so the pendulum does swing. And because I hear it from people so often about where can I go to get the news straight, I do have optimism. I think, well, number one, let me say this. I'm a Fox News contributor. And I continue to believe that Fox News' daytime shows, and particularly Bret Baier's show at 6 o'clock at night, are the best show in news. They are old-fashioned journalists who cover the news straight, don't have an ideology, and you can get your facts and your news from those sources. The nighttime shows are, of course, opinion shows. CNN, with their new leadership, is trying to make an effort to stop being a mini MSNBC. And they were just so full of biased reporters. They're starting to let those reporters go. I'm doubtful the CNN experiment's going to be successful because I think they botched it. I think they needed to just fundamentally announce we are redoing CNN. We are no longer going to be liberal. We are going to be down the middle.
And it's got to be one thing or the other, not a hybrid. It doesn't work.
Well, and they're just trying to fire a reporter here and not say much about it. Don't upset the newsroom there, but sort of change here. And it's not working. People still aren't watching CNN. I was hoping they would make the bold, big play, go down the middle, fire a bunch of people, hire some new people, including some well-known conservatives, and make that case. And then I would have been fascinated to see if the American people would really watch. Do they want to watch unbiased news that right down the middle? I don't think we're ever going to find out because CNN is not really doing it right. But I continue to think there's an opening for it. I don't think Fox would be successful if the mainstream media hadn't blown it as badly as they blew it, and if Fox hadn't managed the news to run it so as well as they're doing it. I don't think their daytime shows would be highly rated. Bret Baier's show wouldn't be highly rated, beating all the competition, if it was not a legitimate news show. And their evening news shows are popular, are number one, because face it, conservative media is booming and the mainstream media is in decline. But I would rather have a flourishing all media, where American people have trust and faith in all media. And we've lost that faith in the mainstream media.
Yeah, I think, that was the great line. I don't know whether it was Charles Krauthammer may have said it, that, what Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes did was to find an underserved niche of the public that actually consisted of half of the American public. And sort of it does make you wonder why someone else doesn't try to tap into that and to try and, not just do a niche, but to try and reach more people, but they won't.
Well,
or at least they won't. They haven't until now.
the mainstream media is the only business I know that when it loses customers, it doesn't say what's wrong with us. Why are we losing our customers? It says what's wrong with our customers.
Right. Exactly. Ari, as we tape this program, we're only 2 weeks away from the midterm elections. One of the ways we talk about the elections, one of the ways we cover them, is to talk about the polls. But we know that there are a lot of problem with polls. As a communications professional, this is part of your business. How much trust should we be putting in the polls that we read so much about?
Well, I went back actually just the other day and I just took a look at the 2018 midterm polls, the 2014 midterm polls. You could put 2020 into it as well. It's a presidential cycle. But in the last several cycles, polls have underestimated Republican performance by about 2 to 4 points, depending on the state. And I suspect you're going to see that pattern again. So I think going into Election Day, if any Republican candidate the day before the election is 2 to 4 points behind, they are highly likely going to win. And that has huge ramifications for the Georgia Senate race, the Pennsylvania Senate race, the Arizona Senate race, potentially the New Hampshire Senate race.
Right, yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. I remember the last 2 cycles watching the polling against Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, where the New York Times reporters, right?
You noted that in your book. Yeah, that was that was wild.
Was in for a close race, the polls show. And in both election cycles, he won by double digits. So you have to watch these races, and just like Republicans don't trust the media, they stop trusting pollsters and they stop taking calls from pollsters. So there's a polling problem here where Republicans are underrepresented. I think this is shaping up as a major red wave now, and I would not be surprised to see the House is definitely going Republican, has been always. That even in August, I never questioned that. The Senate, which I used to think could just be 50-50, maybe 51-49 Republican, I think the odds are increasing with every day. It's 52-48 Republican, potentially 53-47 Republican.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think Real Clear Politics added a feature, which is, for those who are, not political junkies, Real Clear Politics is where, it's a website that a lot of us go to for the latest polls, for lots of other, other information and the top stories of the day. And they've started a new feature in their analysis and roundup of the polls, which shows how much the polls were off before in previous cycles, as you say, and that kind of changes what we think about how they're going to turn out. You're also someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about the Jewish vote. You mentioned your affiliation with the Republican Jewish Coalition. It remains fairly static, with approximately 2/3 or more identifying as liberals or voting for Democrats. But while there are demographic trends involving assimilation and the growth of the Orthodox community that may lead to a diminishing of that dominance, the left seems to believe that abortion is the issue on which Jews can be rallied to remain loyal to the Democrats, at least in this election cycle. Do you think that's proving to be true? And and if it is, what does that say about sort of where we are as a community?
Yep. Well, I think that the numbers, let me just go back in time. In 1992, when George H.W. Bush lost to Bill Clinton, Republicans got 11% of the Jewish vote. 4 years later, Bob Dole got 16%. In 2001, when my boss, George Bush, won, he got 19%. When he ran for re-election, 25%. Romney and Trump each broke 30%. And that's really interesting to me, that the Republican share of the Jewish vote has almost tripled since George H.W. Bush. This is inroads, huge inroads into a base that the Democrats used to take for granted. And Republicans have had a harder time pushing it significantly above 30%. But still, if Republicans can win greater than 30% of the Jewish vote, it makes it very hard for Democrats to win in Florida, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in those battleground states where there's a significant enough Jewish population. So, politics is all about the share that you take away from the other guy. You don't need 50% to win. You need 50% of your own block and more to keep it, but then you take it away from the other guy's base. That's increasingly been what's happening in the Jewish community.
Yeah. Last, it would be tempting to ask you for some political predictions, although you've kind of given us some already. But I'd rather ask you for a prediction about what you think is going to unfold if, as now seems very likely, we're back to divided government with Republican control of at least the House, perhaps the Senate, while Democrats still hold the White House. How is divided government going to exacerbate the division we've been discussing, as well as what will a presidential campaign that I think will almost certainly break all records for divisiveness if, as now seems likely also, Donald Trump seeks to return to the White House? How is the press going to cover all of this?
Well, the fact is, divided government is always up to the president. The president has to make a decision. I faced this with George Bush. George H.W. Bush had the same issue. Bill Clinton did. President Biden will have to decide, does he want to have these remaining 2 years in office be years in which he postures and pounds the table for the left, or will he cut deals with the right? And this was his fundamental mistake of his first year in office. He appealed to the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party instead of the Joe Manchin wing of the Democratic Party. If a president decides, I'm going to have to abandon my own party's wing, its base, the liberal base here, and reach agreement with the Republican majority, Bill Clinton showed you can be a successful president doing that. I have no idea what Joe Biden will decide. I do believe, though, Jonathan, that Joe Biden is not going to run for re-election. I just can see no possibility that in a year in which the Republicans take the House, likely take the Senate, the economy increasingly looks like it's going into recession. Joe Biden remains unpopular in a country in which almost all Americans, 70%, say the nation's on the wrong track. Do the Democrats want to say the person who can lead us through this mess is the 80-year-old president who got us into this mess? I don't see that happening. I see a hunger among Democrats to have new leadership, a new generation of leadership. And I just predict to you the day after the election, Democrat leaders are going to go public with that message. They're increasingly going to say to Joe Biden, you did your job, you defeated Donald Trump. Now it's time for you to let somebody new come along. And they're going to pressure Joe Biden. He won't want to hear it. He's a stubborn man and a willful, proud man.
Yeah, I mean, he spent his whole life trying to get into the White House. As somebody who's interviewed him knows him, I mean, he'll be dragged out of there kicking and screaming.
But I think he's going to get dragged out of there kicking and screaming. I'll predict to you that in February or March, under massive Democratic pressure, he'll announce that he's not running for re-election. And then you're going to have a wide open Democratic field.
Do you think that will impact the Republican choice, as long as we're making predictions? Obviously, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine Donald Trump not running, just because, he really wants to run. He's itching for revenge. But obviously, there are a lot of Republicans who might like someone else, like Governor Ron DeSantis, and that's why Trump is sort of sniping at Ron DeSantis right now. Do you think there's any chance of a competitive race on the Republican side, as somebody who knows the Republican Party well? And if there is one, would that sort of lead to a Götterdämmerung for the Republicans? Because if Trump didn't win, would he basically try to destroy the Republican Party? I mean, for example, in Colorado, there's a Republican Senate candidate who might have an outside chance, if it really is a red wave, of winning what was thought to be a safe Senate seat. for the Democrats. But Trump just told Republicans don't vote for him because he doesn't like me. What would Trump do if he actually lost the Republican nomination, which I don't believe for a minute that he would? But how would that play out?
Yeah, I think President Trump is running, but I also believe he can be beaten. And here's how or why. Here are the three factors, Jonathan, that I'm going to be looking for inside a Republican primary, which is totally on its own track. It will have nothing to do with what Joe Biden does. We have our own dynamics to deal with. One is, how is Donald Trump's health? It's a fair question. He'll be 78 if he was reelected. And it's a fair question to say, how is his health from the age of 78 to 82? Now, right now, you can say the man has tremendous energy. We've all seen that. But one, how is his health? Two, what do the polls show? Do the polls show that Donald Trump is beating Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg more than, say, Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley? Just pick a Republican name. If the polls show that DeSantis is beating Kamala Harris by 5 points and Donald Trump's only beating Kamala Harris by 1 point, and that's a pattern that repeats, that will have a huge impact on primary voters who don't want to blow the election by nominating somebody who has the least chance of winning. So what do the polls show? And then the third issue is, how many Republicans take him on? If it's 3, 4, or 5, Donald Trump wins no matter what. He'll win with the biggest plurality. If it's only 1 or maybe 2, one-on-one, mano-a-mano, it's a fair fight. Donald Trump could win it. Donald Trump could lose it. 2-1, it starts to favor Trump by, again, that same principle of divide and conquer, not enough plurality. But I think if it's a total of 3, Donald Trump and 2 others, he could get defeated. It just depends. It depends on the polls. It depends on Donald Trump's behavior. It depends on his rhetoric. Politics changes. And Donald Trump, for all his tremendous accomplishments, still is vulnerable because of all the baggage that he's brought along with those accomplishments.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, we're going to find out. And hopefully we'll have you back on the program at some point, not in the too distant future, where we can analyze it all. Ari, we want to thank you so much for coming on again and sharing your insights. I want to recommend to our audience your new book. It really is a must read. It deserves as big a readership as possible. Let me make a quick programming note again. Next week will be the Israeli election. We won't have a regular podcast, but we will be part of a JNS TV special where I, along with my colleague Ruthie Bloom, will be breaking down the Israeli election results on Wednesday, November 2nd. There'll be other JNS editors and reporters also chiming in. And we want to thank our audience. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or on Twitter or on the JNS YouTube channel or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you are, what you listen and watch the show, and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.